I will start with a little kind of preamble, and that's just to say I'm really deeply appreciative of being invited here. And moreover, I'm really again appreciative of the hospitality that you guys have shown. It's been absolutely lovely, other than the slightly long train journey. But you know, once I landed in Cardiff, it's been absolutely lovely, and I really look forward to having these conversations after the event as well. So thank you all very much. So as is my approach, maybe some of this will come into the talk, I will start with an apology. Probably quite a few apologies. So this is something that I've reflected on a long time, my own tendency to continually apologize, even if I'm making a point that might be valid. So I find I'm doing this a lot. I've been doing this a lot over many years. And it's a way of sort of softening the blow to some extent, especially when you're trying to, in quotes, speak truth to power. So I sit on a lot of sort of race equality panels, committees, fora, that kind of thing. And it's a very fraught space, I guess. To some extent, happily for me, it coincides with what interests me in terms of a researcher. So one of the apologies is, look, if any of this feels like therapy or catharsis, I apologize. It's not meant to be that. It might segue into bits of that. So if anybody has any sort of psychiatric solutions or anything like that, or counselling, I would embrace that. The talk I've decided to call that Race, Class and Authenticity, which is a word, authenticity, that keeps coming up. Well, it's been coming up for quite a number of years for me personally, but actually within the discourse around equalities and especially ethnicity. But it seems to have actually grown in its frequency over the last few years. Okay, so I'll just give you a quick slide about the structure of this thing. And second apology, please forgive the very feeble attempts at humour. I like using memes and things like this, so I thought that was quite funny myself. Because that professes to be a structure. I'm not sure if it is a particularly good structure, but those are the sorts of things I'm going to talk about throughout. Hopefully it will have a sense of completeness, but again, happy to fill in any gaps at the end. So first, stewardship. So I was drawn to this and I kind of got locked into a bit of a spiral as to what the hell do I understand by stewardship. So for me, I guess stewardship really goes back to my youth, my childhood even. And so the other thing to warn you guys about is a lot of this is very personal to me, and some of it drifts into the politics of, not politics of identity, but political domains in terms of why I do what I do and how I do it to some extent. So when I was a very little kid, and for a while my parents tried to get me to go to mosque. Right, so in those days, mosques was just Uncle so-and-so who happened to know the Quran and he could teach kids a little bit. Occasionally, Uncle so-and-so would be a bit of a nutter and he would kind of, it would be quite, it was physical, but this was at a time when even primary school, the teachers were physical, so I'm not saying that there was anything pathological or special about that type of Islamic school. But at that time, one of the things that has stuck with me ever since, one of the sort of first lessons in my sort of Islamic tutelage, for what it's worth, by the way, very, very limited at that time, and to an extent even now, was when this idea that who are you as a Muslim, right? So from the thing that stuck with me, and there might be disagreement about this, there might be variation, was that as a Muslim you are an agent. You are a representative, you are an agent of the faith and of God. So that doesn't mean to say, so that's the Blues Brothers things, on a mission from God, right, which is a line from the film. So that kind of intersection between the everyday, the ordinary stuff of life and the responsibility toward your maker was really important to me. The extent to which I embraced it changed over the years, because at the time it was memorable, but it wasn't particularly acted upon as a kid. So that's one way for me to root the idea of stewardship. What is it that I am in a sense, in a small way, stewarding, I guess. So for me, part of that is this political identity, a component of which is your faith identity and the extent to which that fits with your broader sense of politics, or indeed the extent to which your faith identity informs your broader politics in itself. So all sorts of little concepts like morality, ethics, justice, responsibility, duty, obligations, you know, things that are very, very banal and ordinary in most people's lives, like, you know, what do we understand by a neighbour? What do we understand by courtesy, respect? Those sorts of things which are very ordinary. And within the academic literature, certainly within the policy and research domain, not really that sexy. Really interested in why is it that these, well, some people choose to become radicalized or terrorists. The ordinary stuff seems to be just too ordinary and not interesting. And I think my turn toward the ordinary happened when I did, with my really good friend and colleague Charlie Husband. Some of you might have read his work. He's been around for many years. He's retired at the moment. He's retired now. But we did some work on social cohesion and counter-terrorism, and we wrote a book about it as well. And that was really quite damaging work. And what I mean by that was you get thrown into this milieu where you have to engage with some quite, what we would probably now call quite toxic issues and debates. And you cannot help but to become compromised or affected by that. It does, I'd say affected, but actually to some extent even infected. So I realized, well, for me it was a very kind of conscious decision that no way am I going to do this stuff again, because it is so fraught, and because in order to do it, to some extent you have to buy into the narratives that underpin it in the first place. So that for me was a political and conscious decision in terms of what is it that I'm interested in researching. So the stuff that I ended up drifting into, and I think that was the other thing, the longer I stayed in academia, the more confident I became. Because when you're an early career researcher, what are you going to do? Well, so in my case, it's like, yes, boss, tell me what you want to do, tell me how you want me to do it. I was very compliant. So there's something there about belonging and in terms of the institution, belonging in academia. So people have written a lot about imposter syndrome, for example, and I think I suffered a lot of that, as do other working class academics. Academia is essentially still, I would argue, an institution that is dominated by middle class sensibilities, right? I mean, it's not a pejorative statement, it's not me being judgmental, it is merely a fact. But when you throw in ethnicity, that complicates matters even further, and it becomes, I suppose it has a bit of a multiplier effect. So for me, and I'll talk about this later on, you know, one of the things was like, oh, actually, I'm just waiting to be found out. Somebody's going to say, right, imposter, sod off, you don't belong here. And the fact that it's a bit peculiar, because when I speak to students, and at Bradford, you know, in the social sciences, we have quite a, you know, fairly diverse intake of students. And for many years, you know, there is one slide on here that says stories, so there will be stories. Some of them are kind of war stories. But students would remark, either they'd say, you're not like the other lecturers that we've had. And I wasn't really always sure what that meant, but sometimes it was a compliment. Other times students who would encounter me but not have sort of experienced a lecture by me, they would assume I was not a lecturer. They wouldn't even assume I was a student. It probably got something to do with the way I dress, you know, a bit of a scruff, I guess. But they would assume I worked in security, and I actually had colleagues in all sorts of sectors who, and this is not necessarily about race, but it's about fitting in. It's about what do you have to do to belong, to get that sense of belonging that is both projected outward and that is represented or refracted back onto you. So there's lots of little ambiguities and tensions there about identity and academia. A colleague who works in my department who did quite a lot of research and produced a book on working class academics, just generally working class academics. And the amount of commonality and overlap between that and academics of colour is remarkable, really. So again, that just sort of speaks to the extent to which academia is still ostensibly a middle class institution, and it is, you know, perpetuated like that because that's how systems work, I guess, and institutions work. So in terms of going back to this point about stewardship, we all, I guess, have different responsibilities. We all have different elements of identity, which call for different types of performances. So here and now, I'm talking to you guys as a peer, I guess. I don't really talk to people like this when I'm with my friends and we're kind of swearing at each other or whatever we're doing, right? So it's a different context. So the performance is contingent on the context. And I think when it comes to stewardship, there's a certain element of stewardship that is at play in all our performances, regardless of the context. So stewardship is, for me, something that runs through identity. So I just thought I'd kind of spend a little bit of time talking about that. The final kind of point I'd like to make is that stewardship is therefore political. It is not anodyne. It is not something that is neutral. It is something that calls for some degree of conviction and embracing to some extent. And it can go by other names. You know, so I just thought it was worth maybe a few minutes on that. So I'll tell you some more stories. So when I first started, right, so when I first started working at Bradford, early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, I actually did bits of teaching while I was still doing my undergrad degree, because I really got on well with my lecturers. They were really, really good lecturers. And in my second year, I wrote my first book. And in my early part of my career, I was writing fiction. I was writing novels. And the first book I wrote was a kind of murder mystery. The second book I wrote was about a drug dealer. And by that time, sort of 2002, I was working kind of as a jobbing academic, doing bits of research, any kind of what we would call up in the north, Joey work. You want anybody to skivvy around for you? Anybody need a brick wall building? I'll do it. You know, it was that kind of, I will say yes to anything, part-time, hourly paid, small bits of research, whatever. And in that context, I was really interested in developing a kind of humanities footprint within the department that I was mostly attached to, even if I was attached in a peripheral way. So myself and another colleague, we kind of knocked out this creative writing degree, which also kind of locked into some sociology as well. And then after that I wrote an English undergrad degree as well. Co-wrote that as well. And it was one of these colleagues who said to me, and I think at this time, you know, this is a segue into the car stuff. For me, I was relatively, I wouldn't say I was wealthy, but I was okay. And I had contacts and things like that. So I managed to buy quite a cheap car, but it looked better than what it was, right? So it looked like it was an expensive car, but it actually wasn't. It was a piece of shit, but it looked better than it was. And this colleague, we had this conversation, and this was a white middle-class colleague who I got on with very well. And she sort of told me, you do know that people think you're an actual drug dealer, right? So I kind of took that as a bit of a compliment, and I'll tell you why. I mean, I wasn't a drug dealer, for the record, and I've never been a drug dealer. Because I'd written this book about a drug dealer, right? So that's part one of the story. But I just want to leave that hanging there for a few minutes, right? So I write a novel about a drug dealer, people read it and they know about it, and the novel is written in the first person, and that's quite important as well. Flash forward a year or two, I'm invited by a writer in residence who works in a prison. And she asks me to do a workshop in her prison based on the fact that she's using my book about a drug dealer as currency in her prison, because she's lending this book out to prisoners, and word gets around that it's a book worth reading for them. You know, I'm not kind of blowing my own trumpet, but apparently it's meaningful. And the fact that there's quite a lot of people in prison for dealing drugs, and a lot of them, a large proportion of this prison population who she's working with, are South Asian as well, right? So maybe there's something in the book that they identify with. And she's using this book to coax people into doing her workshops. If you come to my workshops for a month, I'll let you borrow the book, right? And I'm really chuffed about this. I'm like, this is great. So I go up to the prison, slightly lengthy process in terms of visitors' orders and all that sort of stuff. And I'm sat in a room that's probably about 3 or 4 times the size of this, sat on a little stage with the writer in residence, and there are these men that come in, and most of these men are very big. They're very kind of like ripped and stuff, because for a lot of prisoners, there's not a huge amount to do other than work on your body and press ups or whatever it is that they do. And they're all wearing the grey kind of prison sweats. And so I'm sat there, and the writer in residence is sat next to me, and we are flanked by 2 prison security guards, right? And I'm like, well, this is a bit over the top. So we engage with the audience, and the audience, you know, I always used to get this when I was doing kind of writers stuff, like writers workshops or festivals or whatever. People, there were always at least one person in the audience would ask, how much money did you make, right? And to be absolutely honest, with my first novel, I didn't make a huge amount. It was like not even £1,000. I made money on the workshops on the back of the book, right? That's kind of how writing works at that level, at that really kind of low level, for me anyway. So I said that, look, you know, you don't really get money, a huge amount of money for writing novels unless you're Stephen King or one of these people who sells hundreds of thousands of books at airports and W.H. Smith and all that. And I'm like, that's not me. You know, this is an independent press. Not really sold that many books. And then the guy, oh, brother, he says, brother, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm like, well, what do you mean? So then I go into a foray about the fact, well, maybe I make a bit of money out of workshops and stuff like this. Brother, no, that's not what I'm talking about. How much money did you actually make? I'm bemused by this, and eventually the penny drops. I'm like, oh, these guys think I'm the guy who I've written about. These guys think I'm a drug dealer, right? So at one level, because part of the plot is this drug dealer and how he gets out and he makes money, whatever, right? At one level, it's a bit of a compliment. Because I've written in the first person, and I've convinced these guys, some of them are drug dealers, or have been, and now they're incarcerated. I'm like, hang on a second, they're incarcerated. So I've actually come into a prison to do a workshop with people who are doing time for dealing drugs, because they got caught, and they think I'm a drug dealer who isn't doing time. So at that point, I looked at this person and I thought, these guys are going to kill me. Because it's something of an insult. It takes something Herculean in terms of front to turn up to a prison to tell a bunch of drug dealers, you suckers. Right? So that was my reading of it. So for me, thankfully I came out unscathed. I managed to plead with them and convince them, look, this is fiction. This is fiction. I know drug dealers. I've worked with drug dealers. Some of my friends are drug dealers, but me, I've never even smoked a spliff. You know, I'm not a drug dealer. So I had to work very hard to convince them that I'm not a drug dealer. But what was really sort of affirming for me was that, well, actually, I could write quite a convincing book. I could write a character that they could believe in. So that was good in the end. The other story I've got is this, after I've written these novels, I had a conversation with a journalist, a local journalist. And it was a strange conversation because this guy considered himself to be something of like what we would probably call now an ally. Quite right on, quite left wing, quite kind of liberal, quite inclusive and all that. And fairly soon after the northern disturbances in places like Bradford back in 2001, he kind of lost his shit a bit. You know, he kind of really went off on one. And he said to me something like, what is it about you Muslims? What do you think? Why are you want to be so special. Like, what are you actually talking about? And his point was, you keep making demands. If it's not halal meals, back in the 70s, then it's, you keep having a go about Salman Rushdie, which was still relatively fresh. This was only 12 years after the Satanic Verses kicked off, right? And if it isn't that, it's, you keep doing this forced marriage bullshit. Why do you keep doing that? So to convince this guy that there was a different view, I had to do quite a lot of work. And I suppose that is something that has popped up over and over again throughout my time, there is this critique, and it's a very one-sided critique of certain cultures, particularly Muslim Islamic cultures within the British context. We see this over and over again, whether it's Jack Straw, whether it's Boris Johnson, whether it's Trevor Phillips. Over and over again, there is a problematization. Well, there is a tendency to problematize particular ethnic minorities. And we see this even now. There are these strange coded language messages, not even messages, but communications or media reports around where Muslims are mentioned, but they're not explicitly Muslims. So some of the stuff masquerades as equality or freedoms. So we see this probably most recently with protest marches around Gaza, Israel, right? So there's stuff going on there that I think is probably interesting, but actually quite dangerous as well. So that's all that content. These stories, I guess, are a way of informing you of where I sort of stand and how it is my own sort of experience that produces a sense of politics, which in turn feeds into the type of work that I do. Okay. So as I said in the structure, a nod to theory, and it is a passing nod, I know the theory. Well, some of it anyway. So I'm sort of interested in some of Homi K. Baba's work around hybridity. And this is a guy who's writing about India under Raj, really, and he was talking about how these hybrid identities were concocted through a process of not quite coercion, but essentially the producing of an in-between space. You're not quite one thing and you're not quite the other. So at the high point of the Raj, if you like, the empire, the British, needed Indians to be kind of English. Not fully, but anglicised enough to be able to help them administer the Raj, right? So that was one form and one manifestation of this hybridity and people occupying a third space. But if they became too English or too British, then that would be disruptive. It happened the other way around as well, where they were quite wealthy and powerful Britons who nearly went native. And those who did go native, if they started dressing Indian in an Indian attire, taking an Indian wife, speaking the language, then that was actually put down as a deficit. They've gone native, and that means there's something wrong with them. So there was a weird inverse kind of racial logic that was in play in the context of the Raj. But if you pull that into the contemporary space, into where we are now, I think we see examples of hybridity happening all the time. It's very innocuous now. It's very ordinary, which is interesting. And I think that's the hybridity that we encounter today. So, many years ago, well, quite a few years ago, and you still see it now, there are interesting intersections between one type of identity and another, and they just get thrown together and they mesh. So, for example, I don't know what it's like in Cardiff in terms of Muslims, but you will see young men, for example, wearing kind of Arabic dress, what they call jilbabs or jubab. I don't wear them, so I don't know. But they'll be wearing tracky bottoms and Nikes or Adidas as well, right? Or they'll have a kind of quite modernish type hip-hop haircut or something. So there's a bit of fusion going on there, right? And equally, there's I don't know if anybody's come across Raina Lewis. She kind of works in fashion. And she developed quite an interesting approach toward Muslim fashion, and she called it modest fashion. So she was talking about headscarf predominantly, and the fact that actually people have a lot of choice in terms of how they choose to cover their hair or their head. So, you will see people wearing head coverings of all types. and indeed all brands. And even that becomes is a thing in terms of consumption and identity and taste and branding. So Calvin Klein headscarves, all that kind of stuff. So that's, for me, a very interesting space in terms of where identity can sit and where it can move into. There are limits, of course, you know, in terms of what is deemed tolerable and what isn't. And that's across the board. So I'm interested in this third space. And then I think about, well, where does that leave me? Well, you know, am I, well, I think we're all hybrids. So in what ways am I hybrid? So in terms of research, I quite like the idea of hybridity flowing into research. So my approach to ethnography, for example, I really like the idea of immersive, owned, invested in ethnography. Ethnography is a very, I would say, flexible approach. It allows lots of different opportunities and lots of different forms of data to come through and to be locked into your findings, into your outputs, into your musings, whatever. So I think I was quite, for me it felt like I was taking a risk when I did some of my recent ethnographic work. And what I mean by that is I wasn't really sure or confident about being fully immersed or showing that full level of immersion in my research when I was writing about it. So I find that sometimes you read ethnographies and you're like, all right, but what do you think? I'm like, what do you actually think? So my quick and dirty way of approaching that was by including lots and lots of field notes. Well, quite a few field notes. So in the last book that I wrote, which was about cars, there was a bit of that, and I was talking to Asma earlier, and I was like, well, the next book, if you think, I'm not sure if the publishers will even publish it, because it is it's in some ways quite brutal in terms of the treatment of the subject matter. And the field notes go back 20 years, right? So I'm writing about HE, to be honest, and it's an ethnography of HE. But I think, and I would say this to any kind of beginning researcher, I wish I'd have been told this when I was starting to write. It's like you have to own it. Really invest in it, believe in it, because if you don't, I don't think anybody else will. I gradually started to learn that quite a few years ago, and it's a gradual process, but you need somebody to tell you that right from the off. And maybe in my own case, maybe people were telling me that, but maybe I wasn't tuned in or something. So I think it's really important that, you know, when it comes to ethnography, pretty much anything can be data. As anybody might have, I don't know, Sophie's read it, Asma's read it, you've been very complimentary about the Cars book. Yeah, all sorts of sort of almost seemingly random things, I think, are interesting. And that's the other weird thing about ethnography. When I'm writing stuff, at one level, I really don't care what anybody thinks. And again, that's quite a weird thing for an academic to say, right? Because when we're sending proposals to publishers or whatever, one thing they ask you is, who's your audience? I'm like, I don't know. Anybody who can read? Anybody who's interested? Right? So it's a very kind of particular sort of question, is that. And similarly, you know, when you guys are writing for journals, or even if you're doing a PhD student, even if you're writing a PhD and you're researching for that, you need to think about who's your examiner. You need to make sure it kind of aligns with their research interest. I mean, you know, it's a bit of a game and it may be gaming, but you have to have the reader in mind. So the only caveat I have about my reader is, well, can they read and can I write in a way that is pretty accessible? And I don't know how successful I am at that. I mean, the more I write, the worse I get, I think. But my aim is really, this needs to be about demystifying sociology. So that's another part of my identity as an academic, is how can I make sociology more accessible? Because it's one of those disciplines that is still, I would argue, quite steeped in theory and ideas that were originated by, you know, essentially a bunch of dead European white men, right? And I think it's evolved. It has to have evolved. There are so many rich, vibrant things coming out from what we call the global south that it's almost criminal that that isn't really touched on many sociology degrees, for example. Anyway, so yeah, the notes, by the way, I'm sort of talking around them on the slides. And again, that's, for me, really, is the more data, more passion thing, whatever. I really like this. There was an essay that Orwell wrote back in the 40s, and it was like, why people write. And he came up with these 4 reasons. He came up with 4. One was sheer egoism, like you think you can write and you think people should read what you're writing and you're king shit. Great. That's one reason why people write. Partly ego. Another one is like, you need to record the moment. Historical impulse, he called it. It was like basically something important happens and it needs to be committed to paper. Yeah. And then aesthetic enthusiasm, he's really talking about art, I guess, and the art involved in literature, and people might feel creative or whatever, and they feel amused or they experience something that allows them to be creative and literary, right? And then he talks about political purpose. That, and he's got some interesting turns of phrase in that essay, and it's things like, to kind of get your own back on people. It's to kind of do voodoo. So my literature, my novel publisher, he used to say, oh, you're doing a lot of voodoo there, mate. Because I would be really kind of exercising the demons that were within me in my writing. And, I would change names, I would change things or context, but essentially the issues were really about my politics. So that is another strong motive, I would say, especially if you're an academic, and especially if you're an academic in an area that is fraught and contested and, in a sense, political. So if you're interested in race, ethnicity, faith, that to me by design and by default is something that is fraught. So you better have a position, because if you don't, it'll come through in your writing. Okay? So that's one view. Another reason is, I don't know if anybody wants to take a guess as to why is that people write. Sure.
Career advancement or necessity.
Yeah, exactly it. Well, because you have to. Because you're forced to. Ask kids who are in schools and they're told to write stuff. So yeah, the genesis of research started way back, over a decade ago. It did seem like a good idea at the time, because the research that I'd done before the cars research, a lot of it seemed to reference the car. Because majority of my research was, and it sounds quite parochial perhaps, or very small-minded, but I was really interested in Bradford, and I was really interested in ethnicity and ethnic relations, because I was sick of it, and I still am kind of sick of it, so this is the therapy bit. So I was really frustrated with the ways in which my city, my hometown, I was born there, was being written about, and how its populations were being written about. I thought there was a huge disservice. I thought it was very limited, very narrow, very problematic. But when I was talking to people, the car just seemed to keep popping up, even unwittingly, even indirectly. If somebody, one of my interview participants, if it wasn't a reference to, oh, my car's in the garage, oh, I want to get this car, we were doing an interview in a car, right? So cars were important, and they were really important social spaces. People were doing and saying things in cars that they wouldn't do. It was a sense of safety with the car. So it was really important. And then I started thinking more about the car, right? You know what? Cars are a bit mad. There is so much what Paul Gilroy calls disproportionate investment in cars, that to me was worthy of inquiry. The fact that theoretically and according to how ethnicity was being rehearsed, you would find people who were apparently living in areas suffering multiple, markers of deprivation or indices of deprivation, poor neighbourhoods. They've got nice cars. What's going on there? Well, you know what's going on there, right? Everybody knows what's going on there. Poor neighbourhood, nice car equals
drug dealer.
There you go. Well, they can't all be drug dealers. Who are they dealing to? What is it, business to business? This is ridiculous. Those narratives and those, I would call them myths, were frequently rehearsed. So for me, it was like, this is juice. This is stuff. And then I started researching, doing the literature scoping and looking at what people have written about. And I thought, well, there is this mobilities paradigm. People like John Urry and so on were writing about cars, but then they just stopped. It was like the mobilities paradigm then started talking about everything but cars, to me, it felt like. So I thought it was quite a rich vein. I thought there was a hell of a lot of sociology in it. And I thought, you know what, it's so banal as well. It's just an ordinary thing. Everybody's got a view on cars. So anyway, at some point, I mean, I did apply for funding, by the way, for research, and it was roundly rejected. Obviously, I mean, it was probably because it was a weak project, but you know what, this is just silly. You know, the funders were, this guy wants to do research on cars. Kind of crazy is this. But anyway, so I just basically did it off my own back in my own time. Really enjoyed it. I found it a really valuable, enriching experience. And then at one point I was like, maybe I need to write about some of this stuff, because I was just accumulating there. I was just, it was just going on forever. So I bit the bullet. Again, Charlie husband, more or less my partner in crime, sort of forced me to write about it. 2 minutes, okay, I will be good. So anyway, all that stuff is in the cars. Right, so that's a very quick way of doing that slide. I find it a very rich vein. So I'll end on this probably. Going back to the earlier point I made about the imposter syndrome stuff. I've felt this for a long time, and I think it's not unusual. And there is no shortcut to it. I mean, there's a lot of literature around exclusion and the experience of BME or minoritized or people of color who happen to be in academia. There are these sort of tropes, well, not even tropes, but there are these phrases that come out. We have to work twice as hard to get half the reward. That kind of thing is there all the time. And there isn't a curious, I'm not copywriting it, I'm not claiming it, but there's a kind of a reverse imposter syndrome. And that aligns with this idea of failing upwards, right? So I don't know if people have heard that phrase, failing upwards. And I keep coming across people in academia, obviously present company excluded, who don't seem to do much. And yet they keep climbing, right? So, okay, great, I'm getting a few nods. So you recognize what I'm saying. So that to me is like a reverse imposter syndrome. It's like the ability to blag or something. I don't know, they've got it down to a fine art. I think that's interesting. We're living in a terrain and working through a terrain of what's called white privilege, white fragility, white saviors, white allies. I think that is very, very challenging for everybody concerned. The sector, it has a great deal of difficulty resolving some of those tensions, often leading to very, very performative and policy, a very densely populated policy space rather than one that is about intervention and action. Yeah, I mean, there are a few other points there that we can kind of talk about. I really don't like going over time, and I think I'm at time. 1 minute, okay. So I'm just going to skip over that. So look, if you're a minority ethnic academic, you have quite a few risks, especially if you're dealing with stuff that is important in the sphere of ethnic relations, right? And by the way, it's not an accident that quite a few minority ethnic academics become seen as responsible for race-related matters. And that's not me saying it, you know, this is Sheila Khan writing in 2006. I think it was Sheila Khan, anyway. So being claimed or being defined is interesting to me. So this is just what two people have written about my work. And I was like, really? Okay, fine. You know, that stuff about Black Lives Matter is referring to a book that was written in 1998, right? So you get co-opted, you get used, and I suppose my take home is, well, if you can leverage it, if you can do what people who are failing upwards are doing, then do it, right? So I think at some point we have to kind of bite our principles a little bit. So I'll just finish on this, right? So this bottom one, so that's actually Karim Murji and Bhattacharya who said that, responsible for race matters, right? So I'll just leave with this point. So when I launched a book quite a few years ago, and it was a sociological book, and there was an academic there, a colleague, I guess, and we were talking to the audience, talking about sociology, talking about social policy, talking about race, talking about politics, whatever. And then this colleague had the wherewithal to say to me, in an audience, Yeah, but you're not a sociologist, Yunis. You're a novelist, and a bloody good one. Right? That's what he said. Now, maybe that's a compliment. But actually what he was doing was telling me who I was. And my response began with, well, thank you for telling me who I am. And the second bit was, which I've deleted, I've censored, was now go yourself. Because I'm fed up of being read. And if you're a minoritized person, whether it's class, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality, or indeed ethnicity or faith, that will happen to you unless you're very, very careful about managing it. Anyway, I want to go on, but I will stop in the interest of time and in the interest of making sure you guys don't fall asleep. Thank you very much for listening to me. Apologies for any gaps.